Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, well, it's alright, it's the second episode of the show of the week, as you probably know, and on Friday I kind of hinted that I might do another great episode of the show. Well, to be honest with you, I'd already kind of figured out I was going to do another episode of the show on a different grain distillery, and ta-da! I'm doing today North British, and it's all part of, you know, this kind of looking and asking the question, you know, if there is a difference in the spirit produced at the different grain distilleries. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, North British is very similar to Goodrum insofar that the final neutral grain spirit that comes off is roughly about the same, 94.5%. But does it be different? And of course, we shall obviously find that out in due course. Now, as per usual, any comments and opinions that I make on today's show are wholly my own and bear resemblance to any comments or opinions that my employer may have, Gauntlets of Nottingham. So, yes, this is all me. So, North British, okay, it was built in 1885 in Edinburgh. And almost a bit like Goodrum, it was built because of a bit of an issue, and this issue was about breaking up the monopoly of DCL, or Distillers Company Limited, with regards to the purchase of grain whisky. So what happened was a number of high-profile brand owners such as Andrew Usher, William Sanderson, John Crabby and James Watson decided they're going to build their own distillery. Yeah, why not? You know, we'll take on DCL, you know, we'll have you know, another option if you wanted to buy you know, grain spirit for your blends. And so to build it practically next door to the Caledonian distillery, which was owned by DCL. So it's a bit like kind of to you matey kind of thing. So yeah, production started in 1887. It was kitted out with a single column still, a single Kofi still, and produced about 1.5 million gallons of alcohol per year, which is relatively small when you think about it. I mean, you know, the Goodrum distillery we looked at a couple of days ago is pumping out, you know, 115 million, I think it was litres rather than gallons, but a considerable amount more. But capacity was expanded. 3 years later it was producing 3 million. By the 1920s I think it was up to about sort of 6 million. So, you know, there was obviously a demand for the grain spirit from the North British Distillery, and as is with the Goodrum distillery, the history of sort of North British is all tied up in the big conglomerates, you know, DCL, IDV, all these kind of companies that own multiple distilleries, multiple brands, and essentially were protecting the, you know, the raw materials for these brands, and you know, these distilleries got traded on a relatively regular basis. You know, owners came and went, and certainly by the 1960s the makeup of shareholders was considerably different and included the big companies like Teachers, Seagram's, Lawson, IDV. You know, they all had their kind of like their finger in the pie, shall we say, and like I said, it was all to do with making sure that they could, you know, safeguard the raw materials that they wanted for their blends, because the last thing you wanted to do is have a wildly successful blend and suddenly not be able to get hold of a component part of it, and it changed it entirely, and then you know, you're at the vagaries as to whether that change is accepted by the whisky buying public or not. So in essence, I suppose, you know, North British had a pretty unremarkable history throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, just carried on and producing grain spirit, you know. And it wasn't really until 1993 when it was another takeover happened, and this time it was by a company called Lothian Distillers, who were a partnership between R&B, who are now Edrington, and IDV. And then, then it gets really quite interesting, because IDV was then taken over by, you guessed it, DCL. And so DCL now owned a proportion or half of the distillery that was originally set up to go against it. So yeah, in a sort of kind of ironic kind of fashion, I suppose. I suppose that's always the way, it's like if you've got successful competition, then you may as well buy up the competition, or at least buy into it, I suppose. So yeah, and aside from that, I think that's pretty much it as far as sort of like the interesting snippets of history of the distillery are, and it just carries on its own merry little way. Nowadays, I don't know exactly how much it's pumping out, but it's got a 3-column Kofi still. It differs from Goodrum, interesting enough, in that instead of using wheat and malted barley as its mash bill, it actually uses maize. So that could have quite a telling influence upon the final spirit. So they use around about sort of 75-80% maize and about 15% malted barley. It's a 72-hour fermentation, like I said, which is relatively moderate. And the new make comes off the still at 94.5% and is filled at 68.6%. And some of them, the most well-known brands or blends, purchase the spirit from North British, and it includes things like Shivers, Famous Grouse, Cutty Sark, and J&B. But we're obviously not looking at blended whiskey, we're looking at the grain whiskey. So I think that's enough talking. Let's have a look at the lineup for today. Again, so like the episode of the show on Goodrum, I've got a selection of 6 samples. The age statements are a little bit more closer together. I haven't got a really young North British to sort of as a kind of benchmark. The youngest I've got is a 24-year-old, which, as I said when I was looking at Goodrum, realistically is the point where you want to start bottling your grain. So this is a Douglas Laing Old Particular bottling, 24 years old, distilled in October of 1991, bottled in November of 2015. It's a refill bourbon hoggy, DL110055. Next bottling we'll be looking at is a 25-year-old. This was bottled at 49.4%, by the way. It is a Scotch Mark Whisky Society bottling. This is G1.15, and they called it Could Pacify a Mob. It's distilled in September of 1991, I think bottled somewhere 2016, 2017, I don't know exactly when. It is a single virgin, heavily toasted, medium char oak butt. Okay, it's bottled at 63.9%, and like I said, it's 25 years old. So, bit of ABV there. Third bottling we're looking at is a Duncan Taylor Rare Old North British. This again is 25 years old. Was distilled in August of 1991, bottled in April of 2017, and it's a single sherry cask, which is quite interesting. Interestingly enough, you look at the colour between that and the Scotch Mark Whisky Society bottling, and there's actually not a huge difference. But then this is a virgin American oak cask, so just an interesting aside there. So this is sherry cask 59130009, bottled at 52.6%. Fourth bottling we'll be looking at is been bottled by Single Malts Direct in their Whisky of Scotland range, or Whiskies of Scotland range, I should say. Again, this is again distilled in 1991, although this is 26 years old. Bottled sometime in 2017 at 54.9%. Penultimate bottling is a 30-year-old. This was bottled in the Hunterlang Sovereign range. It was distilled in October of 1988, bottled in 2019 at 52.4%. And the final bottling that we'll be looking at today is again another 30-year-old, this time bottled by Morrison & Mackay, as they were at the time, in their Carmel Celebration of the Cask range. This was distilled in 1988, bottled in January of 2019. It's a sherry puncheon, 68601, and bottled at 49.6%. So, like I said, don't have quite the range of age statements that I had the luxury of playing with Goodrum. They're a lot more closer together, but different cask types, which I think is going to be interesting, and hopefully we will get a feeling of what the North British spirit is like. So let's make a sound. Right, so 24-year-old Old Particular refill Bourbon Hoggy, not a huge amount of colour, so I'm not expecting a great deal of oak. So I'm hoping that this will give us a kind of an indication of the style of the maize spirit. Now it's quite meaty, smoky. There's a real earthiness, and it's got an almost peaty character, not quite. It's got that intense earthiness to it. A little bit of dried fruit, a little bit of high-toned herbal cereal notes. But it is really heavy. It's a really heavy, it's a meaty, it's an intense, it's completely different to Goodrum. I mean, Goodrum was quite high-toned and had a wheatiness and a very herbaceous character, whereas this is a lot heavier. Like I said, meaty, smoky, intense, a little bit of vanilla. I mean, that's absolutely gorgeous notes. Like I said, you know, if you love your Isle of malts, this would have been right up your street. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Again, earthy. That after the finish and the aftertaste is like pure soil. Quite intense, verging on the phenolic, a little bit of tar. Again, meaty, weighty, quite full. Touch of cereal, a bit more oak on the palate, a little bit more vanilla. That's a lovely bottling. That's really intense, and that kind of sets out its stall quite nicely. And I think that's obviously, hopefully, the benchmark for the rest of the tasting, and hopefully we will find this kind of weightier, meatier spirit character sort of as a kind of centre point to this grain whisky. So in this one in the starting bottling, it certainly said, right, the spirit that's produced at North British is completely different to the spirit produced at Goodrum, which is what I was hoping was going to happen. Okay, so let's move on to the 25-year-old Could Pacify a Mob. So this is the Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottling. No surprise, there's a lot of oak. It's intense, it's buzzy, it's spicy, it's bourbony, it's yeah, oh god, that's gorgeous. There's a touch of syrup, but again, the spirit has a real weight to it. It's not kind of being completely overloaded by the new oak. It really is becoming an oak monster, but like I said, the spirit is certainly noticeable there. I'm getting the dried fruit kind of notes. I'm getting that slightly sort of weighty, wouldn't quite go as far as saying meaty in this particular bottling, but again, it's got more of a golden honeyed kind of weight to it, which is intriguing. Let's see what the palate like. Quite masked, dry, slightly tannic, spicy, intense, bourbony, vanilla pod. Again, there's some not herbal. There's some dried fruit character. It's not particularly herbal. It's more kind of like I said, weighty, golden syrup, maybe sort of slightly honeyed. That definitely needs some water. I mean, it really is pretty masked and pretty tight. So let's see what a little drop of water does to that. It's possibly emphasised the oak, although it's a little lighter in character now. It's not quite so heavy. It's got an intimation of rummy dried fruits, shall we say. There's almost a kind of saltiness happening as well. That's quite intriguing. Just pass like that. A little simpler, a little bit more pushed into the oak axis, so it is really quite bourbony, vanilla-y, charred. I'm getting a lot of charred wood, certainly on the aftertaste, and the spirit is a little bit now hidden by all of that oak, but it does kind of, it's still there. You can still taste it, or sense it more than taste the sort of the dried fruit. It's got a nice spiciness. You're going to, again, like with a lot of grain whiskies, you know, they do pick up the oak very quickly, and it just goes to show with like virgin oak, they pick it up really, really intensely. But yeah, I think that's a really, really impressive bottle. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Duncan Taylor 25-year-old. So this should hopefully be completely different, as it's a sherry cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? That's really mellow. Again, quite luscious, quite full, rich. Lovely combination of the dried fruits from the spirit character and the dried fruit of the sherry cask. Touch of tea leaves, a little bit of honeysuckle, milk chocolate. Yeah, that's a pleasant nose. Like I said, it kind of melds together and works really well. It's the spirit, like I said, has a weight to it. It can stand, if it can stand sort of brand new virgin oak, it can certainly stand up to sherry, and it is standing up to it really well. It's certainly not being swamped, although the sherry is relatively subtle. It is still possibly the most noticeable frat part of this nose. But yeah, it's got a nice dustiness to it. And I think it's pleasant. Let's see what the pulse like. Initially, it's more about the cask. The sherry cask, dried fruits kind of come up first. It's very luscious. It's silky. It's soft. It's smooth. Touch of spice, dried apricot, sultana. It's a lovely wood spice aftertaste. The grain dried fruit does come through towards the back end of the mid palate and into the finish. So it's got a lovely progression. Like I said, kicking off with the sherry, moving into the grain character, but still retaining that lovely spiciness right on the finish and the aftertaste. Really well balanced, and I have discovered this with other grain whiskies that have been aged in ex-sherry casks, that they work really well together. Certainly if they're the more robust style of grain whiskies, and they just seem to sort of work sometimes a lot better than the single malts do, which do seem to be kind of like a bit, you know, overwhelmed by sherry on some occasions. I think it's the sort of the intensity of the grain that actually kind of stands up to the sherry quite nicely. So yeah, I think that's another lovely whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to the Whiskies of Scotland 26-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? And now we're in the kind of like the oxidation phase of its existence, which is quite interesting because the previous two, although only being, you know, a year difference, lots about the oak. I mean, yes, this is a bit got quite an oak, old oak kind of background, but I'm getting a lot more of the what I would expect, the rummy, dark, treacly dried fruits. Demerara sugar, vanilla. Again, it's got a real weight to it, a real presence, it has to be said. This is not your high-toned Goodrum. This really has some intensity, and this is it. This is part of the skill of being a blender. You decide what you want your end product to be like, and then you source the raw materials. And if you want that, you know, slightly lighter, grassier end of the spectrum, you'd probably go for a Goodrum as your grain component. If you wanted something a bit more weighty, a bit more meaty, a bit more intense, then North British is where you would go to. So I think it's got a lovely smokiness to it as well. Partly wood smoke, partly spirit, possibly. Yeah, that's again a lovely nose. And here, this is it. You know, so far 4 different bottling companies, grains, and they have all been absolutely gorgeous. And like I keep saying, you know, you really need to try a good grain whiskey, because life is not complete, shall we say. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Still full, still quite rummy, dark sort of sultanas and dark grape, that kind of character. But it's got a slightly lighter note on the palate, possibly the alcohol, which is just giving it a slight lightness, just to sort of like balance up the sort of the richness of the and weightiness of the spirit. Lovely finish, slightly treacly. Again, that balance just keeps going, and that alcohol is kind of almost making it feel a bit salty in actual fact. I mean, it's 54%. I don't think it needs any water. I'm not going to bother putting any water because I think it's just à point, as they say in France. And yeah, it's just really lovely balance to that palate. And like I keep saying, yeah, grain whiskies can be really intriguing, and this one, like the others, certainly is. Okay, so let's move on to the Hunterlang Sovereign. So this is the first of the two 30-year-olds, 52.4%. So let's see what the nose gives us on this end. Now this is quite intriguing because this is kind of, and I suppose this is here we go with the whole single cask business that you get. It doesn't matter whether it's a grain distillery or a malt distillery. You will occasionally get the odd cask that does things other than what you'd expect, and this is almost tropical in character. It's lighter, it's slightly more oily. It's got a sort of a real kind of burnt toast, sort of toasty, oaky sort of note. It's a sort of a bit of banana, there's a bit of apricot. This is kind of like, ooh, this is all a bit left field. This is not what I was expecting from North British. It's got, well, I wouldn't quite say, it has a lightness of being, a slightly more elegance, I suppose, as opposed to a sort of like a weightiness. There's a little bit of almond shell, a little bit of, yeah, again, toast. I mean, I'm getting toast, but it's not overbalanced, or unbalanced, I should say. Overbalanced, unbalanced. It's just different. It's just a complete outlier at the end of the day. It's just, it hasn't followed the theme of all the rest of these bottlings. And yes, it is North British. Well, I'm certain it is. I mean, because you never know at the end of the day. Sometimes people put the wrong labels on, but so you kind of have to go with the fact that, you know, it is what it is, says on the label, but it is completely different in character, which is One of those wonderful things, isn't it? Anyway, let's see what the Pacify. Soft, juicy, wonderfully succulent. Again, has a lightness to it, which is what I wasn't expecting. It's got almost tropical fruit character. You know, there's apricot, banana. No, it's not any pineapple, it's banana. And there's a little bit of spice, a little bit of toasty oak. Probably not quite so much toast as there was on the nose, but yeah, just completely the other four. If I was tasting that, I would have not put that down as North British. Certainly not after tasting the other four samples. And like I said, that's the wonderful world of single cask bottlings for you in a nutshell. Still absolutely gorgeous, lovely bottling. And finally on to the second of the 30-year-olds. This is the Carmel Celebration of the Cask 30-year-old sherry puncheon. Let's see what the nose goes on this end. Now this has kind of more in common with, I would say, the Whiskies of Scotland bottling. It's got a big, rummy, dark, dried fruit character nose. There's an earthiness. There's a real sort of raisinated fruit character. It's dark. There's an edge. I don't want to go and say it. There's sort of sulphury. It's kind of, the trouble is, you see, I have a nose that's very, or should we say, appears to be quite susceptible to sulphur, and I really do pick it up even in the smallest amounts, and there is just a little bit there. I mean, it's not enough to sort of go, oh god, that's a sulphur-ruined monster, but there's, you know, anyway, I'm going to just kind of ignore it because, like I said, it's got a lot more in common with the Whiskies of Scotland bottling in that, and I suppose with the other ones it kind of comes back. It is more weighty. It's kind of intense, earthy. So pass on. Again, juicy, succulent. Again, it has that kind of darkness, sort of, you know, somewhere between the Whiskies of Scotland bottling and the other sherry cask bottling, and there's that slight sulphury note. It's not going to put me off this particular bottling. It's contained, shall we say, and there is a little astringency, there's a little bit of tannin, and the trouble is when you get a little bit of a sort of a sulphur blemish, it does kind of sort of give it that sort of, often that sort of slight astringent note, which is kind of jars a little bit, but it is what it is, I suppose, at the end of the day. It's not sort of like a dreadful bottling. It's got an edge to it. It still says North British in that sort of like weightier, fuller style. It certainly shows up that the Sovereign bottling was kind of like, you know, a real kind of outlier at the end of the day, because it does pretty much conform to the other bottlings, and yeah, like I said, there is that sort of slight edge to it. I think a number of people probably that are not particularly sort of susceptible to sulphur will probably just not pick it up whatsoever. And you know, great. Again, lovely bottling. So yeah. Right. Okay. So let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, I think it basically cements the fact that there are differences between the grain distilleries. It's not just all neutral grain spirit. Obviously, in North British case, the raw materials, i.e. the maize rather than the wheat, has played a significant role in the character of the spirit. And I think, although the old particular bottling was 20 years old, it certainly gave us a real insight into the character of the spirit. It was earthy, almost phenolic, it was meaty, it was full. Because there was not a huge amount of oak input into the final spirit, it allowed us to sort of view the pretty much uninhibited character of the spirit. So it set things out quite nicely. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottling, again, lovely bottling, showed that the spirit had the guts to stand up to sort of like, you know, virgin American oak. And yeah, all right, it was maybe a little bit oak centric, but you know, grain whisky can be like that. I don't think it was overly woody. I certainly enjoyed it, and you know, I thought that was a really good bottling. The Duncan Taylor bottling, again, 25 years old, again quite rich. The sherry casks, just showing that the spirit can withstand not only sort of like virgin American oak, it can withstand sort of heavy sherry casks as well. Really nicely balanced, and again, you know, a lovely bottling. The Whiskies of Scotland bottling, again, you know, this was more in the sort of like the darker dried fruits, the rummy kind of character, what I would expect of a grain. But again, you know, it showcased that sort of weight of character that the North British spirit had. The Sovereign bottling, like I said, was kind of like the odd man out, so to speak, and just goes to show how that even single casks from, you know, big grain distilleries can turn out completely different to the norm. And this was just, you know, very unusual in the whole kind of concept of the style of the spirit from North British. This was kind of lighter, it was more elegant, it was dried fruit, it was just, you know, just the way that particular cask had kind of developed, and that's what we love about single cask bottlings. And the celebration of the cask bottling, like I said, it was, you know, very much of the style of the distillery. Yes, there was a little self blemish, but I don't want to sort of labour that point, because again, it had a real natural character. And this is, I don't know whether this is particular to grain spirits, grain whisky, that it has this sort of lovely natural character. Maybe they're not quite as complex as single malts, you know, but like I keep saying, yeah, they're considerably cheaper. You get a seriously aged spirit, but they don't, I mean, none of these tasted that old in actual fact. And you know, I mean, I knew they were old in grain terms, having tasted sort of like a lot of old grain whisky. But if you're not sort of particularly au fait with sort of like, you know, grain whisky, you would have thought that they were a lot younger. And this is another wonderful thing about grain whisky. Like I pointed out, it ages amazingly well. So, so yeah, I hope this will kind of like, you know, or these last couple of episodes of the show will kind of like pique your interest in grain whisky, and I hope you will kind of like, you know, look for it and at least give it a try, because, you know, life's too short for not trying it at the end of the day. So we're probably not going to do another grain whisky episode next week. I think that would probably be a bit of overkill. So don't know what we're going to be doing, but I'm hoping it will be good. Of course it'll be good. Anyway, until next week, it's good dramming and good afternoon.